So we realized that the history of race and the history of sex as concepts were very intertwined with each other. The other thing that we perhaps didn't realize at the time, because we took it so for granted, is how much the British tradition, particularly since the 60s, was a tradition of debunking concepts. It was one of the things that I found very refreshing about British anthropology. It was debunking all kinds of concepts, some of, in one case, borrowed from Lévi-Strauss, in other cases, doing it all their own. Lévi-Strauss started it with totemism, and then it moved on to even debunking notions like matrilineal and patrilineal, and we found this very refreshing, or at least I did. And albeit in some ways it never got anywhere, but then we realized in looking at the history of race in anthropology, we could definitely see as bad stuff ultimately getting replaced with better stuff. It was a fairly straightforward history, and certainly we could see that in terms of factuality, scientific validity, post-Boas was a lot better than pre-Boas. Sex was more complicated, because what we realized was that very little of the anthropology of sexuality actually was based upon any significant improvement in factual knowledge. In that way, it was different from race. There were changes in fashion that had more to do with what was happening to sexuality at home than anything new that happened. The best example of this are the Berdashes, now two-spirits or whatever you want to call them, that started out as evil sodomites to the Spaniards, except for a few who thought that the men dressed as women in order to be allowed access to women's space and seduce women. But basically, evil sodomite was the first incarnation. Then the second incarnation, during the Boasian era of rehabilitating the primitive image, it wasn't really about sex at all. It was about symbolic cross-dressing for ritual purposes. So it got desexualized. There was no new evidence to support this. It just was a more convenient way of seeing it. There was no real reason to see it that way. Then you got a little whiff in Benedict about tolerance of difference, but it was a whiff. That was as much as she was able to say at that point.
What about the, I'm trying to remember the guy who did the California, the Mojave, Devereux.
Yeah, Devereux. Well, Devereux, you got relativism coupled with psychoanalysis. Yes, it was an illness, but it was an illness that certain societies had made accommodations for. Again, the evidence doesn't really change. The interpretation changes to fit the flavor of the month. Then you got a long period of relative silence about all kinds of sex, including that. Then you get the revival of sexuality in anthropology, and the first people to do this are a whole crew of gay anthropologists, and suddenly the Berdashes become the forerunners of gay lib. Again, the data haven't changed much.
There's maybe a bit more data, but as it's historical by then.
There aren't any real Berdashes anyway, except some contemporary gay Native people who have chosen to identify themselves with the Berdache tradition. So, and then we start thinking, is this true throughout the whole history of the anthropology of sexuality. And of course, you have at this point Foucault becoming a major influence, and Foucault gives us something to hang it on. We have been criticized by some people who think we use Foucault too much, other people who think we don't use Foucault enough. But what really impressed us about Foucault was his idea that you had, in a way, this myth that previously sex had been repressed. And then in the early modern era, thanks to Freud, sex had been liberated. And Foucault says that sex was never repressed in the way they thought it was, that in fact there'd been a compulsory discourse on sex all along, that what happens is that the discourse gets shaped to fit the needs of the people in power at any given moment. And that became the key to the argument of our book, that the sexuality of others had been conscripted to fit the flavor of the month in the metropole. And now it's up to you.
Well, there were other patterns we found that were curiously persistent. For instance, there are a number of stereotypes of sexuality of others that are persistent from even before the days of the Enlightenment, but certainly since then. I should say the coincidence of these stereotypes in the history of sexuality and the history of biology is no accident, because Linnaeus uses sexual criteria in describing plant species. And of course, it is the presence of breasts that distinguishes mammals, or most mammals, and so on. And but the stereotypes are primitive sexuality as an excess or a deficit. If primitive sexuality is nature as opposed to our culture, what is natural is a question. What is nature a good thing or a bad thing? Rousseau or Hobbes. Excess can be a good thing. The early portraits of Polynesia, free love, as in Diderot. Alternatively, sexuality can be vulgarly excessive. Early stereotypes of Africa and more unfavorable stereotypes of Polynesia. Inuit sexuality may be excessive, and the women can throw their duggies over their shoulders, according to Buffon. However, it would appear that Iroquois sexuality is the reverse. The Iroquois are undersexed. Their deficiency shows, according to her ex-colleague Tom Abler, in the fact...
Well, not according to him. It doesn't show according to him.
No,
it shows according to texts he analyzes.
He uses, exactly. Because otherwise we get him wrong. But in the text he analyzes, the Iroquois are seen as deficient because they're undersexed. They don't rape their female captives, not just because of...
As any good red-blooded American male would.
Because they're undersexed, not just because they have a code of honor. So if an excess can be a deficit, so can a lack, a dearth. Either way, the signs are negative, and we are positive. And the exception are the happily oversexed Polynesians that appear in Diderot's supplement to the Voyage of Bougainville, and in a way reappear 140 odd years later
In Mead and
in Mead and
Malinowski.
Malinowski. Right. Now, another thing that's interesting is, of course, all these stereotypes fed in to the Victorian ideas of the origin of marriage and kinship. The idea of primitive promiscuity is central to MacLennan, to Morgan, to Bachhofen. And social evolution is the move from an immoral Hobbesian mess to Victorian sexuality, and hopefully, according to some like Engels, beyond. Women may not be the equivalent of men, but they are treated even worse by primitives than by us, because we at least treat our women with honor. So that is the Victorian message. And you can sort of see this crudely in MacLennan's ironically entitled tableau, Australian Aboriginal Marriage Ceremony, which depicts something like the rape of the Samoan women. So all of a sudden, around 1890 to 1910, along with high social evolution, or along with extreme social evolutionism, the doctrine of primitive promiscuity takes a huge hit. Köhler in Germany, whom we don't really deal with, Wake in Britain, and above all else, Edward Westermarck and the British sexologist Havelock Ellis and the British classicist and anthropologist A.E. Crawley hit the idea of primitive promiscuity. Perhaps the most balanced account is Westermarck in his book on primitive marriage and his book on morality, the origin and development of moral ideas. And Westermarck says, and here he's basing himself not on his own fieldwork in Morocco, but really on a survey of the ethnographic data that's there. The evidence shows that some so-called primitive groups are more promiscuous than we are, and that some are less so, and that there's not a place in the world that doesn't have moral standards, only the moral standards as to what is acceptable differ. And instead of having progress from a lack of morals to the presence of morals, we have what he is later to call total ethical relativity. The other people, like Crawley and Ellis, with whom Westermarck was associated, are less relativist than him. And he was not a total relativist. Ellis sees savages, quote, savages, unquote, as undersexed. And Crawley says that savage societies are so taboo-ridden that they need Saturnalia to be able to enjoy sexuality and reproduce the species.
There's a teeny bit of that in Westermarck, hence the title of our book.
There's a bit of that in Westermarck. Westermarck says that
irregular
connections increase with the advent of civilization.
Which is where the title of our book, Irregular Connections, came from.
So the interesting thing is we can't go into causality, but there's something very interesting here. Along with Burton, who from a male chauvinist perspective and a pro-polygyny perspective bashed Victorian morals. This is a racist critique. He was an outsider.
The racist critique and the Playboy critique.
Together. But aside from him, all three of the people we mentioned just now were outsiders from late Victorian or pre-Edwardian morality. Ellis eventually enjoyed a semi-detached marriage to a pronounced lesbian, Edith, who was also, like him, a campaigning feminist. He was an associate, Ellis, of Eleanor Marx and the eugenicist Carl Pearson.
Margaret
Sanger, and Mary Stopes, the birth controllers. He himself apparently had never had an orgasm in intercourse until a brief affair with a mistress late in life. Apparently, the marriage with Edith may never have been consummated, and the only thing that he said gave him sexual satisfaction was watching women urinate. This gave him a perspective critical of Victorian sexuality and critical of evolutionism. Westermarck is more complicated. He appears to have had, according to talk, homosexual relationships while in Morocco. And this was, quote, well known, but we came across no evidence other than the fact that in his book, his autobiography, he mentions an attempt at seduction by an innkeeper and how he repulsed it, and indicates that he had homosocial attachments to and chaste attachments to young friends. But he clearly was not a typical late Victorian.
There is no hard evidence of his ever having had a sexual relationship with another man, although in fact he's sort of assumed to be gay by the contemporary gay movement.
Exactly.
But there's also no evidence of his ever having had any sexual relationship with a woman.
Yeah, and what he did was also not only critique primitive promiscuity as a hypothesis, but also deal with the cross-cultural incidence of gay behavior and the possible reasons why gay behavior occurs. He preferred environmentalist explanations, military societies and the like, whereas Ellis preferred hereditary explanations. But neither excluded the other. So we find a Westermarck much more complex than the person who wrote about the incest taboo. Crawley gave up anthropology after a book called The Mystic Rose, which people like Evans Pritchard thought was a classic. And he gave it up to write on lawn tennis, which he also played for the Times. And when he died, the obituary said this well-known sports writer was also an anthropologist. He died on the tennis court, which made Roger Keesing very proud. Roger Keesing wrote to me when I made an inquiry that, like me, Crawley was tennis mad, but I know nothing about his life. In fact, only recently I found out that while Crawley was happily married, his one intense and chaste attachment, which he thought more important than marriage, was to his best male friend at boarding school. So every one of them had a position. They were positioned to critique Victorian morality and the assumptions of moral evolution, sexual evolution, on which it was based. Does that mean the facts that they found weren't there? I'd be less sceptical here than Harriet, because I think there was some increment in knowledge, but at the same time, what was known did not necessarily dictate their conclusions. Their position perhaps enabled them to see the flaws in the previous ethnocentric and racist arguments. And
I have less confidence in you that what they came up with was any closer to something we could call truth than what preceded
I
them.
think Westermarck was closer, but even he believed that
They believed in rutting seasons.
The understanding of sexual biology was by no means complete at the time, and Westermarck and Ellis believed that because of a lack of protein, primitive men could not maintain their sexual powers all year. And perhaps just as there was periodicity in female sexuality, so also there was in male sexuality.
They didn't understand the difference between menstruation and estrus.
Well, these are facts, you see. But
They're facts. I'm saying that their new synthesis was not necessarily based on suddenly hitting on correct facts in the way the rejection of the race hypothesis was.
I mean, this is emphatic. She is emphatically correct. You know, I see them as an improvement, but they are limited by their times, by the fact that despite disdaining much of evolutionism, they're still wearing spectacles divined by evolutionist optometrists.
One early reader of our book said something that I found very helpful in toning some of the stuff I was saying in the first draft down, and questioning a bit more some of my assumptions, was that I've noticed that in your work, and here they're referring to both of us, you tend to use the word relativism or non-relativism when what you mean is agree with you and don't agree with you.
Harriet had, with Malinowski was our first published project, and what we looked at was the way Malinowski got people to disclose things to him which normally anthropologists don't get people to disclose to them. And you start wondering how. And what he got was incredible, but he used it to critique ideas of chastity before marriage in the West.
And
Yeah.
and both he and Mead, their work was really much more similar than either one of them would have wanted to admit in their lifetimes. Both he and Mead developed cross-culturally a very important notion that happy marriage is quite possible, happy and relatively monogamous or even totally monogamous, if a little boring marriage, is quite possible after a period of sexual freedom. Now, obviously, there have been all kinds of questions raised about whether the alleged sexual freedom ever existed in Samoa. And the answer to that, if there is an answer, there actually may be a factual answer to that one, in the work of Penelope Scheffel, who said that what neither Mead nor Freeman and her other critics realized was that there was a tradition of for commoners giving their daughter's virginity to a chief, after which the daughter's sexuality could be deployed to advance their family's standing, and that in the mind of Penelope Scheffel was neither sexual freedom nor sexual repression, but something quite different. But Mead and Malinowski, along with Bertrand Russell, undoubtedly paved the way for an acceptance of, in their times, among the certain segments of the elite, and now pretty much across the board, of a certain amount of premarital sexuality, albeit with rules. You can live with somebody with whom you have a relationship. It's still not quite acceptable, at least for women, to sleep with whomever they like before marriage. Birth control, sex education. Ellis was part of this too. There were real social changes that the anthropological work was used toward that have been real changes in our society, whether it's based on better knowledge of the people anthropologists studied or changes in how we interpreted that knowledge, I'm not sure. But changes in the West happened partly as a result of anthropological work, particularly Coming of Age in Samoa. It was an incredibly influential book. And in England, Malinowski, Bertrand Russell, who was arguing for trial marriage, easier divorce, and all of this stuff, had a very heavily annotated copy of Sexual Life of Savages in his library. Bertrand Russell's library is actually recreated at McMaster University.
A lot of it's there.
They bought his library and set it up with either the original furniture or similar furniture, so you could actually go into a diorama of Bertrand Russell's library and know what he read and how he annotated his books.
I might say that one of the things that, of course, you explain if you're influenced by post-structuralist models is not just presences. So a lot of our work was covered a period where there's an immense amount of ethnography written all over the world, the 30s, 40s, and 50s, and early 60s, but very little ostensibly about sexuality. This is partly, and this comes out in the preface to Audrey Richards' work, that in a period of depression and warfare, sexuality seemed to be a frivolous subject. And also, to a certain degree, sexuality seems to get buried
in kinship and marriage.
In kinship and marriage studies, and in culture and personality studies that increasingly focus on breastfeeding and child training. And so the emphasis changes for a while, and instead of actual sexual behavior, we have the sex life of triangles and circles.